when I was maybe seven or so on how to
Okay.
program with BASIC. And I then ended up learning how to program from a book.
From a
And
book
then at
at the
some
age of
point,
7. Okay.
and then at some point when I was eight or so, my dad actually ended up buying a computer off the black market. It cost actually as much as an apartment at the time. My mom wasn't too happy with him, but that gave me access to a computer. And yeah, it was like a pretty old 286. And then I started coding on that.
Welcome to Just Products, the podcast for founders and innovators. Hosted by a founder's friend, Nicola Dolenk. Let's explore what drives success.
So me and basically a high school friend of mine, Teemu, who I also got to join the company, Teemu and I, between the two of us, in about 2 months, built the first multiplayer mobile game ever, I believe. I've always wanted to build products and platforms and things. We sort
Yeah.
of evolved into being more of a tech recruitment platform and marketplace. I bootstrapped that to 80 people at peak. And then a couple of years ago, once the market conditions changed, all the tech layoffs started, selling became harder.
Today, we bridge the gap between building for the 286 and building for the age of AI. Oleg explains why no code is a dead end and reveals the builder's dilemma. Happy to be here.
I'm really delighted to have a chat with you, Oleg, and I am excited to go into some of our discussion today, which is going to be about pre-internet era or internet bubble era, and then what it's like today. You've had a long, vast experience, and you've helped a lot of young developers become better developers over your career. And happy to focus also on what gets you excited about today's programming and what's going on in the scene. Please, if you would like to give your own introduction to the audience, and you can
Yeah,
probably do it.
so yeah, maybe I could, since you mentioned the topic of me getting started with programming pre-internet, I could give a quick sort of background at how I got into it and why,
Yes.
and say a few words about what I'm doing now and why I'm still excited about computers and so on. So yeah, basically, I was born in the Soviet Union, which is a good hint as to how old I am. And my dad worked at a research institute doing meteorology, hydrology, fluid dynamics. And back then in the Soviet Union, you couldn't just get a computer, but these institutes did have access to computers. These were like IBM PC-AT clones that were imported from Taiwan, I believe, and
Okay.
were made up of random components and things that were salvaged from other computers or maybe were bought secondhand or whatever. Anyway, during their working days, they would do serious science there, but on weekends, all these Soviet scientists would come in and play computer games.
Okay.
And my dad brought me along one weekend when I was maybe 4 or 5 or something. To me, that was such an experience of seeing the first computer game and getting to play them,
Yeah.
that at that age, I got hooked on the idea of building a computer game of my own. And then what happened was, like, my dad managed to find a book when I was maybe seven or so on how to
Okay.
program with BASIC. And I then ended up learning how to program from a book.
Okay.
And then at some point when I was eight or so, my dad actually ended up buying a computer off the black market. It cost actually as much as an apartment at the time. So my mom wasn't too happy with him, but that gave me access to a computer. And I basically, it was like a pretty old 286. And then I started coding on that. The thing is, like, there was only so many games and there was no internet, so you can download new ones. So at some
Yeah.
point, once I got stuck playing those games, I realized that actually there's like a basic compiler and a C compiler on this. So I started playing around with those. And then, along the way, I moved to Finland. And again, like by then in Finland, people were already using 486s. I still had the 286, so I couldn't play the latest games. So for
Okay.
me, like coding was like my sort of creative outlet, and it was the equivalent of playing games. But what happened was I got very much into building game engines, and I in particular wanted to build 3D games. But the
Yeah.
issue I had was I was more interested in building the engine than the game itself. So I did a whole bunch of iterations of building these
Yeah.
game engines, worked in like a computer store, assembling PCs and so on.
Yeah.
Then when I was 17 in high school, I was at a house party in Tampere where I grew up. And like the boyfriend of a classmate of mine said, "Hey, there's this new company in Helsinki building games for mobile phones."
Not
Well,
those days.
sorry, that was not common. In fact, like there were no games for mobile phones because mobile phones only supported calls and text messaging at the time. So that sounded interesting. I mean, it was games and mobile phones were cool. So when I was still in high school, I moved to Helsinki for the summer. I worked at Riot Entertainment. I was employee number 13 when I joined. And then I think like 2, 3 months later, the company had grown to a couple hundred people with offices all over the
Wow.
world. And during my last year of high school, I still kept on working for the company. What
Okay.
was nice about it was that, when you were looking at PC games or console games at the time, they're already quite sophisticated. So you need a whole team of people to build it. But
Yeah.
the platform restricted you to text messaging only. And then around the same time, like first mobile web or WAP, as it was called,
Yeah.
devices came out. It meant that like a team of one or two could actually build something, you know, that was very cool. And because it was a new platform, it could be used by a bunch of people. So me and basically a high school friend of mine, Teemu, who I also got to join the company, Teemu and I, between the two of us, in about 2 months, built the first multiplayer mobile game ever, I believe,
Wow.
using text messaging as like the
Next
protocol.
level. Technology already allowed for two people at that time to build something that was scalable and big and could be used by many. Like
Yeah,
today, like people are amazed that suddenly AI can do a lot as a one person team, but you were already building stuff that people are using at scale, like at
yeah.
that point in time.
Yeah, I think that's always happens with any new platform medium. Like if you look at mobile apps as well, when the iPhone came on the scene in 2008, there's so much stuff you can do that a small team or even one person can do a lot. And I think with AI, we're witnessing the same now. How much you can build is accelerating, and we can get back to that. But
Yeah.
because there's so many opportunities, the fact that you're first to market allows you to capture a large chunk of the market. I mean, you wouldn't go about trying to like start a company to, I don't know, build like a buffer.com alternative, say, because,
Mm.
you know, such solutions already exist and there's many different ones. But if, you manage to catch that wave just as like Twitter was taking off, then building a buffer is something that, anyone could have really built. So, but at the same time, I think it's a
Okay.
little bit silly to try and like chase these like sort of killer ideas and so on. I think whatever you try and build, you should sort of try and build for the longer term rather than kind of building to flip.
Like I can follow the expression.
Oh, yeah. What I mean is that you basically build something quite simple on top of some new platform in order to then make a quick exit. Right.
Okay.
So
That's,
the
yeah.
idea
Okay.
is that you don't try and build a business that you'll still be running, say, 5 years from now, but your whole strategy is like spend as little as you can to build the thing that can grow as quickly as possible so that
Mm.
once acquirers or whoever comes along, then you're able to sell that for a decent amount without having to care about maintaining it longer term or turning into a long
Long-term
defensible
project. Yeah.
business, if you will. So
Yeah.
yeah, anyhow, I'll just fast forward through the rest. Basically, after that, I started a company where we built MVPs for startup in return for equity at reduced rates. So I got to work on a bunch of interesting projects. I worked as a fractional CTO for some companies before such a
Yeah.
term existed. I tried to bootstrap my own startups. I
Yeah.
did some early stage investments, worked for Tech DD, technical due diligence, worked for VCs for about 20 years as a bit of a side gig. 10 years
Yeah.
ago, I started Tough Bite. Initially, we were also doing just software consulting, but very quickly we realized that these companies that we were building the MVPs for wanted to hire the technical talent in-house.
Yeah.
So then we pivoted towards being a tech recruitment firm. Since I've always wanted to build products and platforms and things, we sort
Mm.
of evolved into being more of a tech recruitment platform and marketplace. I bootstrapped that to 80 people at peak. And then a couple of years ago, once the market conditions changed, all the tech layoffs started, selling became harder. The company is, been evolving, shall we say. So now we're down to about 20 people or so, still profitable, but actually
Yeah.
like tech recruitment is now maybe half of our profits, and the other half roughly comes
Mm.
from doing sort of consulting again, but the type of consulting we do has changed quite a bit. So AI
Yeah.
is at the core, and we're either helping vibe coded sort of
Mm.
projects kind of get like refactor the code into such a state that it can be maintained and new features can be developed
Yeah.
further, or then we're helping like legacy existing larger software applications by introducing AI so that AI coding assistants and such
Yeah,
can work on maintaining that code. Plus, also advising some startups now and AI native startups and starting a little venture of my own as
yeah.
well.
That's when you go through what 25 years, it takes a few minutes to, even if you're fast forwarding it.
Yeah, I try to be quick here, but
No,
yeah,
no, there's no need to be. I think the audience would appreciate this. Somebody who's also been in the start, or like regards, I regard myself as a person who's been around the startup scene for a longer while. We haven't crossed paths before, even though many, especially in the engineering developer side, you also run the, is it Java gatherings?
yeah, I run the Helsinki JavaScript meetups, which are like a monthly meetups for JavaScript developers, which I guess most developers now work with JavaScript, so it's sort of the lingua franca of programming languages. I've been running that for over 10 years and still am involved in that. But yeah, I run a few other meetups. I run an invite-only meetup for CTOs. I help out with the Hacker News meetup, and I'm looking to get a new AI meetup off the ground in the next couple of months as well.
Nice. Busy man. I want to ask about, since you've seen a lot of startups and you've taken up a role as a CTO and fractional CTO before that was even a thing, and you've seen technology evolve through all these different phases, and it's affected your business as well, and how you do things. Where, how do you see like fundraising these days?
Yeah.
Mention that. Are you, because you are a person who builds platforms over quick flips, if I'm, or like you would favor that, and that has more value. And we discussed before this also that you're interested in creating like a workflow
Yeah,
automation tools and more.
exactly.
So like,
So I have this tendency towards maybe over engineering is a wrong word, but I like building complex things that'll be around in a while. So I don't like taking shortcuts when it comes to the architecture, but also
yeah,
there's this feedback loop that once you start like designing a better architecture, then you realize that actually that architecture allows for far more than maybe what the problem you initially set out to solve. And then there you have that temptation to sort of like turn it into a more generic platform, and there's always that tension, right? Because like, even though that's maybe more interesting and that seems like it's the sort of thing with more potential, at the same time, you can then end up just kind of building that engine, the underlying platform, and never actually having contact with customers. So in your own little perfect world and in isolation, you built this all singing, all dancing Swiss Army knife of a thing that can do everything. But in
yeah,
reality, it never really sees the light of day and no one is ever using it and no one's getting any value out of it. So I think that's kind of a constant sort of struggle that I face. And I expect I'm not the only one where it's
yeah,
like, I don't know what you want to call it, perfectionism or the desire to do something bigger that then like actually prevents you from doing the bigger things because you don't
yeah,
have those users giving you actual valuable feedback on what to build and how to evolve the tech. So
yeah. So do you have a concrete example from your journey where you realized this happened with a project that you feel comfortable sharing?
I've got plenty of examples, but maybe I can actually tell you about what I'm working on right now and
Yes.
explain the dilemma that I'm facing literally this
Okay.
very moment.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
maybe you
That
can give
makes
me some advice on like how I should go about it.
happy
I think
to.
like the advice is kind of obvious, but
Yeah.
what I found with giving advice to people like doing startups is that it's a lot easier giving advice from the sidelines than when you're actually
Yes,
there.
a sideline guy.
No, I wasn't implying that. What I meant was like you just need to be able to look at what you're doing from the outside, and then the answer is obvious. But if you're actually doing it, you have all this kind of baggage and preconceptions, and you have the
Yeah,
sunken cost,
you locked your way of thinking.
yeah, blinders
Yeah,
on, or what have you.
yeah, you're
Yeah.
working
So
with.
the thing that the big vision I have, and the thing that I want to build that I think AI enables is a kind of AI native workflow automation platform, right?
Yeah.
Or essentially a
So
platform that allows you to build your AI agents, for lack of a better word, right? So if you think of
yeah,
tools like Zapier, N8N, and so on,
yeah,
then the way they work is you have some process, repeatable process that needs to be done, and typically you're not very technical or you don't want to write or maintain code. So what you do is you go and use this graphical tool, right, or some sort of like a form type of a web interface, to either visually describe your workflow and the logic or sort of answer a bunch of questions in a
yeah,
wizard. Right? Now, the thing is with AI, the problem is like all these solutions at some point, like you reach a certain limit because you can get basic workflows working easily, but then at some point, like the visual representation of your workflow becomes so complex that it's like impossible to make head or tail of it. And there's no concept of like reusable modules. There's no revision control, none of these good things that you have with code. So at some point, like either they become a mess you can't maintain, or then you end up just rewriting the most critical workflows as code anyway. Now, what AI is very good at, as we've come to learn in the last 12 months, is producing code, and it's becoming increasingly better at that. So sort of my belief is that, these kind of no code, low code workflow automation platforms,
Yeah.
and actually, in the future, you will just tell the computer what you want to automate, and what it will do is it'll produce the code to do that automation and run those workflows in a deterministic manner, right? And you as the user don't even need to look at that code, but the code will be there. So if at some point you need to scale it or migrate that workflow somewhere else, you could bring in a developer and reuse all that business logic you've already created to do things in a
Yeah.
more robust, reliable manner, or maybe even integrate it into your core product somehow. So
Or
that's what
yeah.
I've wanted to build. Now, this is one of these boiled ocean type of ideas. Clearly, a lot of other players are moving into this space.
Yeah.
So what I've done is like I thought, okay, what's the wedge? Like, where do I start so I can gain some initial traction so that I would have the resources to build out this platform? And I looked at a whole bunch of different verticals last year. And in fact, I even managed to sell the workflow to a local VC to help them with deal flow generation, right? So
Okay.
built like a workflow for identifying new startups, sort of started by serial experienced entrepreneurs. And that was quite easy to do. And it helped me build out some bits of the platform. But I
So
realized,
to be
yeah,
clear, so it's looking at profiles and what they're doing currently. What is the like workflow?
yeah, exactly. I mean, every
Yeah.
VC has a slightly different thesis. So in this case, they invest in mostly Nordic startups with a big focus on Finland. So it looked at public company information and identified whenever certain individuals that have been known to have successes in the past to join the boards of companies, for example.
Okay. Fair
That
enough.
can be
Yeah.
expanded to look at LinkedIn and so on and so forth. Investors want to always be the first to have the conversation with the founder who's likely to be successful starting a new venture. So it's all about like early signals and so on. But in a way, that's just an example of a workflow that runs on top of the bigger platform. And the thing I want to really be building is an underlying platform, right?
Yeah.
VCs are surprisingly like difficult customers to build stuff for because they don't actually have that much money to spend on their own IT infrastructure.
No.
And they all have very disparate and different sort of systems that they use.
Limited amount of VCs globally as potential
Ex-
customers compared to
Exactly.
other domains.
Exactly. Now, what I also realized is that in the age of AI, where building is becoming easier, cheaper, and so on,
Yeah.
what is actually more important is to be heard. So building an audience through like writing a blog or having a podcast, for example.
Where we
So
are.
create here we are, so creating that content. But what you want to be doing is creating content that kind of like communicates your thoughts about where things are going, and isn't kind of purely salesy, but sort of thought leadership, but also sharing like your day-to-day struggles, what have you. And
Yeah.
obviously people are starting to use, chat GPT and such for producing a lot of this content, but that content comes across as AI slop because people don't put enough effort to feed in enough of the context to the
Context.
prompt, or the prompt itself hasn't been crafted properly to really like have the output be in your style using formatted in such a
Yeah.
way that it doesn't come across as AI generated and so on. So what I did was I built some workflows that I tried it on myself to do that and run this process of creating LinkedIn thought leadership content using this kind of an interview approach. And
Yeah.
also I had another iteration of it that I built as a Slack bot. You can access it right now at ghostlyn.com, GHOSTLYN.com.
We'll put that in.
Yeah. And the way Ghostlyn works right now is essentially sort of the 2025 way of building AI agents, if you will, which is you come up with a very clear, well-defined workflow that you want it to perform, the data it operates in, and then you just like, in some sense, hard code. So as part of any conversation you have with the bot, its goal is to collect a certain amount of information from you.
Yep.
And then at the end of that conversation, it outputs using a function call the exact things that's collected. For example, you have a setup flow and it collects like, what's your company do? What's your ICP? And that's how it's being built right now.
How, like on that note, how are you balancing what the ICP wants to hear with the authenticity of the thoughts of the producer, right? Because the algorithms by general will optimize OS content like an ICP wants to hear.
Yeah.
Now, should you, as the person selling a product to this ICP, start suddenly talking exactly the way the ICP wants to hear? Or do you factor in an element of authenticity, as in this is actually how they talk, and try to balance not changing that into something completely different? Grasp.
Right,
Well,
I think I
that's
understand what you're getting at. Though. Yeah, I think
because
at the end of the day, that's down to the actual content creator. So this is a tool, and you can sort of have it produce whatever kind of content you want. The key thing is like to prevent the AI from producing AI slop. It's very important that you share some insights, that you don't just regurgitate stuff that others have said.
so you're
Tone is
looking for
important.
originality.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's more important. And I think if you want originality, what's important is that the topics that you write posts about have to be both relevant to your audience, but also be ones where you actually have something to say. So I
Yeah.
think that the key with the workflows in Ghostlyn right now is identifying those topics. And there's two ways that it happens. One is the sort of author, the content creator themselves just throws ideas at it. But those
Yeah.
ideas are then rated on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how likely they are to resonate with the audience. Or then if you run out of ideas, you can have the AI generate new topics for you, and then you pick the ones you like. The whole idea is that you have like a list of topics that are rated in terms of how likely they are to be of interest to your audience. But you don't have to pick the ones that are the top rated. You can pick the ones that are second or third or fourth or whatever in the list. But these are the ones where you actually have something interesting and valuable to say. And then you
So
can start
have
this
you
interview process.
Yeah, I think the audience can go in and try the functionalities themselves right now. So it's a functioning tool.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
this
and it's
resonates,
completely free actually. It says it's $29 a month, but it's an alpha at the moment, so you
okay.
can just ignore that and sign up. But the point
Yeah.
I was trying to get at was the way in which this is developed is such that adding new sort of workflows is a fair amount of work now. But the thing is, it's becoming easier through using like Claude Code and other coding agents. But still, you need to tweak it and you need to set the sort of guardrails as to how the conversation should go, and you handcraft each prompt for each type of
Yes.
conversation with the AI. Now, at the same time, for the coding itself and for doing some of the work that I need to do, to have a much more agentic sort of workflow. So I use Claude Code. I give it a bunch of tools. I give it access to my file system,
Yeah.
in a sandbox environment, but still.
Yeah.
And then I just kind of prompt it without there being any sort of pre-existing structure. And through these tools like web search and local file system access and MCP servers and so on, oftentimes you're able to achieve a lot more in a way because you have that flexibility to then sort of adjust the workflow in any way you want.
Yeah.
Now, everyone is doing this, or more technical people are starting to use Claude Code for various things. Then we
Yeah.
had this Claude bot, which took off this week, which, less technical people are starting to use. But, the idea with my workflow automation is to essentially build something like that, but that is just more secure, more convenient to use for non-technical users, and it runs in the cloud. So you don't need to buy a Mac Mini or whatever to run this thing. And the funny thing is, like, in order for that to work in a way that it doesn't cost you too much, you need to sort of have certain elements of security abstraction in place. You need to
Yes.
have like these micro VMs that are spun up very quickly for every chat session and so on. So there's a fair amount of technical detail. But certain services have emerged which allow me to do that already now. I assumed
Nice.
it would take longer for the technology to catch up, or maybe I'd have to build that whole infra myself. But now I'm in this position where on one hand, you have Ghostlyn, which has a clear use case, well-defined workflow, and so on. At the same time, I've also built something that is the next generation of the technology,
Yeah.
where everything that Ghostlyn does that took me a week to build can be summarized in a single skills file,
Yeah.
and in a way that can be customized for every user, and then gets me much closer to this longer-term vision of having a platform. this is the challenge. Like you have the underlying tech that allows you to do so much more. Maybe
Yep.
it's a little rough around the edges, but it's clear that this is where things are headed. And then you have the old way of doing things that kind of works, and
Yep.
you could start selling right away. You're kind of at a crossroads. Do you try and do both, but then your focus is split? Do you do the first one, get some initial traction, and then once the underlying new next gen tech matures, you roll that out? Or do you like just delay the launch and build on things the new way and essentially redesign the existing workflows as skills? So, it's tricky, right? And I mean,
So
I
how do
guess
you prioritize that, right?
how do you
That's
prioritize? Because, if you spend time doing things the old way, you'll need to rewrite it soon anyway, right? Then it's like,
yeah,
well, it's kind of wasted effort. But at the same time, if you don't get anyone using it or paying for it, then
yeah,
it's like maybe you think this is the best thing since sliced bread, but you're just delusional because you haven't actually had anyone really use it. And once people start using it, it'll
yeah.
be like, just
So
split,
the
or I
question,
can use something else, as an alternative.
yeah. So the way I've approached this particular, I don't know, builder's dilemma in the current world, right? The way I look at it, quite simply, is one of the weirdest habits, at least Finns have, the Finnish entrepreneurial culture, which is less apparent in like the States, I believe, is that firstly, you like have to focus on one thing. Like in Finland, especially, it's like you need to be building only one thing. But if you look at the most successful entrepreneurs, they have 7 or 8 or I don't know how many businesses, right? They have a multitude of businesses and nobody questions. Elon Musk has, I don't know, 7 huge projects he's working on
Yep.
simultaneously and nobody gives that a second thought. So I think there's this huge misconception of you can't be building everything at once. Uh, then on the other hand, you have another thing that has happened in modern world is like the creators who hoard attention. We talked about this, right? Do you build your blog, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
They hold attention and the money they make on the platforms they start. I take Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast makes 10 times more with his conglomerate than YouTube, the platform he started on, is like making. So there's this whole new aspect of a creator being able to be a business in itself with a lot of business lines under it. So the way I've tried to approach the dilemma is more as like, how well defined can you define your ICP and then start building around that ICP and different tools that help them. And in the other aspect of the, for example, what I'm seeing in the intersection of like art, I have my poetry stuff that I'm interested in, and I have all these friends who are in the entertainment business, and then I have people who are in the software side of things.
Yep.
So the tension is you feel you can build anything, but for example, now I had a discussion yesterday with a guy who's studied software engineering, hadn't done it for 7 years, started now, and he's like, holy shit, these tools, man, like you should try it. Like I'll set the whole environment up for you and you can start coding these apps. Like you're saying, like people can just talk and people won't be able to see the code. But I am a different ICP than the person who knows technical stuff. So you need to be deliberate about, are you building for people who have an interest in obsessing about, for example, content or obsessing about something else? And then they just want somebody to abstract the technology part of it. Because if you're building a tool for a bunch of CTOs, they will likely have a different perception of what is possible. And then, like, for example, this whole content creation thing may not be something that comes very natural to them. So you could use, I'm using Higgs field for animating videos currently, where animating a video back in the day would have been a huge learning curve and like a new skill to learn. And now like the computer abstract that. But somebody who's been doing animation for a really long time, they're focusing on something completely different, or they're still doing something by hand themselves in that animation because the computer is not, you can't control it well enough.
I think you almost need to have like, whenever you build something, I think you need to understand like what are the sort of opportunities that the thing you're building you allows. But then when you talk to customers, your ICP, you like intentionally put the blinders on and focus on only their problems. Don't try and serve the needs of related potential customers and so on. But then
Yeah.
that gives ability to, on one hand, really hone in on those specific problems and come up with a scalable sort of solution for that segment of the market. At the same time, if for whatever reason things don't work out in that segment, you have the ability to pivot relatively easily because you haven't closed any doors when it comes to the way you build the tech. But, again,
Yeah.
I think that whenever you build stuff, there's always some reusable components and there's still a benefit in knowing your stack, right? So
Yes.
you don't want to be like writing one, MVP in Rails, another one in PHP, a third one in Java, and a fourth one in JavaScript. Because if you build those reusable blocks that you're comfortable with, then actually they're like Lego pieces. And if you use the same tech stack for all of them, then getting the next thing out and the one after that becomes a lot
Easier.
easier.
That's an interesting angle to look at the whole thing as well, as because I reflect, for example, my writing. So all of my writing, you said, for example, if your tool, if you don't give Ghostly enough context, it won't be able to write with like you've
Right. Or I
written
mean,
because
what happens then is it sort of hallucinates something. I mean, to the extent it makes up cases like in stories and
yeah.
stuff.
So the
Which is
more the machine has your context, right? The same way a developer has more content in their code base, it
yeah,
just becomes easier to spawn up new content. And I'm currently also building, like I use my previous writing as a context base for my current writing as an editor. So does this text look like me? Is this leveraging my strength of my content through like just a simple Gemini gem, basically?
yeah.
So I'll just feed it whatever I just created and then ask my previous context to act like an editor, and then it edits it. So it helps me keep the structure. Like this is a new form of going. So I think an aspect to when you said this, that you're doing in JavaScript and you're using a certain language to build the whole thing, like when I'm building, I'm currently reflecting over, should I do an iOS app or should I do a web app? And if my product, you're putting your product on the Slack marketplace, right? And you can buy
Yeah.
through there. So depending on what sort of app or outlet you choose, the unit economics of that will also be different. So if I put the unit economics, say the price of the product is the same, but if I put this product on the App Store, even though the functionality is more or less the same and the workflow is more or less the same, the unit economics of a thing on the App Store will be completely different than a web app that has SaaS and maybe a link, because the margins are different. If you do this, the whole code base will be different. So if you're doing an app, or please correct me if I'm wrong, if you're doing an iOS app, how much of that code base is actually transferable to a SaaS product?
Yeah, I
Right?
mean, these are the questions, right? I mean, if you like are a solo founder, say, and
Yeah.
you'll always be building only iOS apps, and nothing else, then, pick like the most native way to build iOS apps, use Swift, right?
Yeah.
However, if you're like not sure whether it'll be only iOS or maybe you'll have Android apps or maybe you'll have a web app or maybe you need to have a Slack bot or what have you,
Yeah. Okay.
then what you want to do is pick like the more generic technology. So by using, JavaScript and TypeScript, you could use something like React Native. And yeah, the mobile apps won't be as good, but more of this, your stack is the same, which then allows you to move some of your logic from like one application to another. Now, of
Okay.
course, you can nowadays with AI just kind of like with a one-shot prompt do a rewrite from one language to another, but still like your brain can only like sort of handle so much, and if you want to
Yeah.
produce good quality code you need to be able to review it. So if you're like context switching between reviewing like 5 different languages, then that's going to slow you down. Modular blocks, try and reuse as much as you can, but if you know you're never going to need that, then by all means pick whatever is the optimal sort of stack for the platform you're operating on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. But isn't that exactly a sort of like technology thing that could help? I'm just thinking out loud here. That comes to mind like an idea where there would be a platform that in an agentic way helps people shift between languages, build on these different platforms. I don't know what the good example here would be, where there's an equally good web app to an equally good iOS with the same sort of infrastructure that everybody's using currently.
I think that the AI coding agents are going to keep improving. So actually doing these ports from one to the other will be easier and easier over time, but still there's
Yeah.
always going to be some little quirks of whatever stack you chose, and there's still going to be some manual work that you need to do to apply the
Yeah.
polish when you do those sort of rewrites. And again, why would you do a rewrite if like the AI understands the existing code base anyway? I don't know. I think
Yeah.
the jury is, I mean, this is kind of the big question, really. Like, it's easier to produce code all of a sudden, but also like it's harder to capture the attention of potential users and customers. So where does the value shift? I think the go-to-market and those distribution channels become increasingly important. But also the flip side of it is that maybe all of a sudden people start building more bespoke apps for their own needs, or
Yeah.
for
For
some
their
very sort
own.
of niche communities. Because if you built something to scratch your own itch and you know that there's like 100 other people that have that same problem, each of which is willing to pay you, I don't know, 100 a month or whatever, then all
Yeah.
of a sudden, since you don't have to pay developers like thousands per month to maintain this, and you can just use AI
I
agents for it,
think.
maybe that's a viable business all of a sudden, like a little side gig. And you've got this nice
Yeah.
little app that only has 100 users, but in total they're paying you 10K a month, and it's worth your
Yeah.
effort to like put in a couple hours a month to maintain it.
There's somebody willing to pay you specifically to remove that friction from them. And there's this whole, like, we could go on, and this is a whole separate discussion, but there's this, like, the more code that is out there available for computers to use as reference, the faster it is going to build. And there's a case to be made that like open source is eating closed source because of this. And the way like open source projects have always worked is like they work because people give it attention and they like the idea behind it and it solves the problem. And many people think that they use the open source code to build something for themselves. And they like the fact that it's open source because they have the skills to configure it to their own needs. But then there's like large corporations who need standardized blah, blah, and are happy to pay to somebody to hold like a stable version of it, right? So maybe it's a combination of like micro entrepreneurs and maybe this trend where the future already, like there's already glimpse of the future in this type of behavior. I truly believe.
Unclear how this is all going to play out, right?
So I think the bigger question for me is, should I actively engage and try to build, or should I just wait until technology catches up to a point where it abstracts the stuff I don't know to a point that I can build them? And I was reflecting over this fact because I had this poem I wrote when I was 16. You talked about you got into working life when you were 17 and you're already building like ridiculous stuff at that point in your life. That was really challenging, right? So when I was that age, I wrote a poetry book. That was the first thing I did. And I drew the stuff myself. And I still have that with me, right? And I now put that on Higgsfield and blow up and I can draw I can make movies suddenly, which is like prompting, right? Could have imagined. So maybe if this is my vision, I should have just waited for 20 years and wait for technology to catch up for somebody to do it, right? Or should I actually just start to be building? And I think instead of waiting and asking, I do feel some comfort in actually actively trying to build, actively trying to create value, actively engaging with people. And I hugely respect and admire anybody like you who put together and maintain gatherings for decades, right? Where people can get together and still get together because you created a space where people can gather and so on. And I think that is super meaningful, regardless of where the future goes.
Right. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think like building is fun. Like if you look at social networks and the way people interact with computers, historically, you got two sort of ways of interaction. One is you consume, and the other is you generate, right?
Yeah.
It's tempting to sort of be the consumer. That's kind of the easy way out. And you can always deceive yourself into thinking that by reading some papers or like long blog posts, you're somehow educating yourself. But the truth of the matter is you learn so much more by doing. So actually by building stuff, you learn what's important. You learn from your mistakes. And yes, you might learn some stuff that's useless, but your brain has high plasticity.
Yeah.
You will forget the stuff that's irrelevant. You will hopefully remember the stuff that's important.
Yeah. And in
Your
the
brain will be
building
more
also,
engaged, probably more healthy for you as well.
it creates more agency, but in the building also, you find the questions you want to ask. So you realize, I don't know how to do this. So then you go somewhere to find a source, to read that source, because that's helped you build, and not the other way around, where you're just like passively consuming content, thinking it might be valuable someday. So like content suddenly becomes valuable because you are building, and it may have the answers you're seeking. And I think on
Completely.
that note, it's
Yeah.
good to pause because we're running out of time, and I want to leave some of you for some more time for you as well to get on with building. So
Very
my
good.
question to you is, who should be in contact with you, and what would you, anybody listening to this or reading even a second of it, what would you hope? Do you want them to go and try Ghostly, come to your meetups? What is your ask?
Yeah, I think I'm keen to talk to founders of like software companies at any stages. Kind of my agenda is slightly different. Like at those that are at later stages that are trying to do more founder-led marketing and sales, I'd like to chat to them about Ghostlyn and you know, some of the GTM workflows that I'm looking to build. And then those that are
Yeah,
at the earlier stage, you know, there I do like to talk to people that have like vibe coded something, have managed to gain some traction, maybe even have paying customers, but are struggling to sort of like to get the app and the code base to a level where it's easy to keep developing new features, because I might be able to help with that.
amazing. On that note, I at least will go straight into Ghostly after this and actually try that thing because I haven't done so yet. See how that workflow goes. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure chatting. And until soon again for the audience.